Hey folks, how's it going? I'm still working on this method of transforming 3D Blender assets into RPG Maker assets. One of the weird issues with RPG Maker assets is that there's no vanishing point. Obviously, because we're working in 2D, it looks kind of orthographic or what some people call isometric, but at the same time, there's no foreshortening on um, the, the the front faces as the camera tilts upwards. The camera basically looks down at the image, or seems to look down at the image from about a 45-degree angle, and yet there's no foreshortening whatsoever on the front faces of things. And if I try and demonstrate that in 3D, if I look at a cube, for example, so normally when you're looking at it in perspective, and you can see by the grid lines at the bottom, it all disappears towards a single vanishing point, which is somewhere around here, yeah? If I look at it in orthographic perspective, just remove those parts so that it's not so cluttered on the screen. It, there's no longer a vanishing point, which is very similar to what the perspective of RPG Maker is. However, or the typical assets that you would find in RPG Maker. However, the what's also happening is that the objects, every single object in your scene, is actually being sheared or skewed, and so basically the it's like grabbing the back face of every single object and and moving it on the z-axis upwards. So everything in the scene is getting warped in that, like that. But it's not just that. So, like I say, this is a perfect cube, and yet what's actually happening is it's not just getting pulled upwards, it's also getting pulled backwards on the y-axis. It's getting stretched, and then it's getting skewed on the z-axis, like so. So every object is sort of elongated and sheared upwards, right? And not in perspective, obviously, but in an orthographic view, which is not typical for anything that you would see in 3D. I mean, it's completely unreal. It's a kind of 2D hack that we just understand sort of intuitively, but yeah. So that's the problem that I've been solving, and I've solved it. Okay, so, and I'm going to show you what we've got cooking, and not only that, we've got another little bit. So hang on, I'll just toggle out of edit mode for a second, and I'll jump back into GIMP for a second. In my GIMP project, I've got a whole bunch of grid lines. I've got a grid and I've got snapping on, and so I can like snap to the grid, and you can see how you can would be able to cut this tile set up and create a level for parallax mapping in GIMP or Photoshop or whatever, by using, in this case, a 32 by 32 size grid. I should note a couple of things actually before I continue with the 3D stuff. When working in GIMP, it's really useful if you're going down the route of creating parallax mapping, therefore like not using RPG Maker's internal tiling system, but actually creating everything in an image editor. It's well worth, particularly in GIMP, setting up your your grid so that you can quickly toggle it on and off and display it correctly, and everything is quite easy to do. It's all in preferences, which is somewhere around here, and then I can't quite remember, to be honest, but it's yeah, default grid here, and I've set the foreground color to pink, and I've done that because it's an unnatural color that rarely appears, so I can see the grid on black, and I can see it on white, and I can see it on green, and I can see it on all the colors that you'd normally see. And I've also set the spacing to 32 by 32. I'm using 32 by 32. You're probably using 48 by 48. And then additionally, also in preferences actually, I've set my interface or my hotkeys up wherever that is. Well, I can't find it at this particular time. It's in here somewhere. Um, but I've set it up so that my G key toggles the grid on and off, and if I hit Control G, it turns snapping on and off, which normally would be under View Snap to Grid, but I've assigned it to Control G, which has taken away from my ability to use the gradient tool, but I never use the gradient tool, or very rarely, and I certainly don't use hotkeys to get to it, and so it's very easy for me to toggle it on and off, and yeah, so that's just a neat little thing that I've done just to make working in GIMP a lot easier. Anyways, back to Blender, because this is the fun bit, this is the proper bit, this is why you're watching this video. Is some of the stuff that I've kitted out in Blender. So first of all, this thing here, that's a camera, by the way. If you've never used Blender before, that's what a camera looks like. Normally it's more of an oblong, and it looks deeper, but this is an orthographic camera, as you can see here. So under the camera menu, it's orthographic rather than perspective, so it shoots in orthographic. It's pulled away from the scene slightly, but it's set up a particular scale, and I'm going to try and remember everything that I've done with this. So the orthographic scale is 7. If I go into some of the other settings here, yeah, the resolution is 3200 by 3200, and that's really important. That is basically because I'm using 32 by 32 size tiles, so that's basically just 100 tiles, yeah. In addition to that, I've created a plane, and I'm going to bring that plane up in a moment, which is under here. So I'll enable all of this stuff, and we've got this camera grid here, right? And this camera grid falls right in front of the camera. Now, there's no depth of field. I might not have toggled it off, but there shouldn't be any depth of field when you shoot. But there is a grid sort of laid out in front of the camera, like directly in front of the camera. So if I shift into into camera mode, you can actually see this grid, and it's like a perfect 32 by 32 tiled grid that is just like set up like so that the camera is just looking through it all the time, right? It's a bit weird to look at because, you know, we're dealing with 3D software and it doesn't render everything. But all that is a plane that's been subdivided 99 times to create 100 squares in each direction. And it's got a modifier on it called the wireframe modifier, which basically turns all of the vertices and edges into physical geometry, and so that this grid can, if you want it to render out when you're when you make a render, when you capture an image. So that's one thing that I've done. And again, if I look through the camera view, and this is kind of hard to see, but it fits perfectly to the camera. So you can see this yellow line down the side. That is the edge of the camera, and if you notice that this grid here, it hits it spot on, right? And another thing that's down here as well is our base plane, and this base plane, we've got two. We've got one that's just regular and one that's stretched. I'll just turn the lights off. So this base plane is a perfect square, and it's exactly the same width as the camera, right? And so and there's another version of this base plane that has been stretched. So this one's perfectly square, and this one is the same thing that has been stretched on the y-axis, right? I know that the texture just disappeared there, but don't worry about that. So this is the perfect width of this camera, but it's been stretched to a specific amount, which is on the y-axis by 1.41417, right? Don't worry about that number. But the point of that very specific number is that when I rotate this plane by 45 degrees on the x-axis, so if I just dial in 45 there, right, now when I look through the camera on 0, the camera, that plane perfectly fills the camera, and you can see again, hang on a second, if I select the camera and go back in, you can see again there's a yellow line around that, and that is the camera board. That is what the camera is seeing. It's very thin, of course. I know this might sound a little bit weird, but basically, when this is tilted 45 degrees, it perfectly matches the camera, and because it's an orthographic mode, there's no perspective change or anything like that. Okay, I'm just going to shove that back to 0 for a second. Now the next thing, okay, so what we've covered so far is we've got a grid in front of the camera, which I can show you here. Yeah, so this is a perfect 32 by 32 grid, and we've got a plane at the bottom that perfectly fits the camera when tilted at 45 degrees. Okay, now the next thing is we've got the lattice, which it has been subdivided up as much as it can be. It can only be subdivided up to 64 by 64, but we don't have to worry about the grid spacing of that. But this has been using a modifier, has been shrink wrapped to the base plane. So when I rotate this base plane on any axis, but basically on the x-axis, the lattice will move with it. Yeah. Now, of course, because it's been shrink wrapped, this is basically like a projection coming from one direction. So this is being projected downwards on the lattice is being projected downwards onto this base plane here, right? And because of that, when this rotates on the x-axis, yeah, this is still the same depth from there to there, but it's always being projected downwards, so it squashes, like it doesn't stay the same size. And what it needs to do is be stretched out. So there's a little process that I've figured out. So number one, this has got to be stretched on the y-axis, which is away from the camera, by 2, precisely 2, because at a 45 degree angle this is half as big, and so this has to be twice as big. I know that might not make too much sense, but just trust me, alright? So if I scale this on the y, right, and I'm hitting some keys S, Y and 2, oops, I'm doing it in the wrong mode actually. I always forget that. So in edit mode, scale on the Y by 2, and then smash it into enter. And then when I rotate this base plane here, and then scale on the X by 45. Oh no, sorry, not scale on the X, dumbass. Rotate on the X by 45. Right, this lattice is rotated with it perfectly, and it's also stretched to match the grid perfectly. Now it's no good showing you that it's perfect. Like if you view the grid in front of it, you wouldn't be able to see it because the dimensions are different for the actual squares on the lattice. But that's, I don't know, weird stuff. Don't worry about it. But basically this has been stretched perfectly, and it's also been angled perfectly to fit that grid 100%. This is going somewhere, trust me, right? And so I'm going to undo all of those changes. So first of all, I'm going to zero that rotation out, and I'm going to change this back to scale by 0.5 on the X, sorry, on the Y even, right, okay. So now it's back to normal, right, but, so we're going to ignore the lattice for a moment, and I'm also going to, in fact I'm going to mute out the base plane entirely. So the other thing that we've figured out is that we've altered the grid up here. So the grid, we know, well, you know, through a bunch of calculations and experimentation, I've figured out that the world grid should be precisely 0.07. That's just how it is. Don't ask me why, it is. And because of this, I know that this here, looking down from the top, this grid perfectly matches a square that would match this selection here. 100%. It matches spot on. And these front faces here, again, also measured to 0.07. Also would perfectly match this section here, right? And so now I've got a kind of a synergy between the perspectives of the RPG Maker perspective and Blender. And so what I can do here, like I say, I can model in Blender perfectly normally, just as anybody would. And this is a really simple house that I knocked up in about 10 minutes or something. And I'm very rusty with Blender, and I'm not even that good, to be honest. And I could go much further with a model like this. A few textures downloaded from Blender Kit. But very little effort put into an asset like that. You can also notice that these windows are actually glowing, like that they're emitting light. There's certain things that you can do in 3D software that you just, I mean, it's just a whole effort to do in 2D software. For example, if you wanted to change all of the textures of this house, it would just be crazy. But in Blender, everything is just click, you get it done. And one of the things that I'm really excited to do is actually start creating assets, like creating like doors and windows and rooftops that can all be interchangeable, and perhaps even procedural. I might even like try and create like procedural ground. But the thing is, just to rewind a little bit, this we know that that is exactly 2 tiles high and that is exactly 3 back. And each of these models are connected to the lattice, which is a kind of a deformation tool with a modifier, which is easy to learn in Blender. So you just attach them to the lattice, and then of course you enable the ground plane. You rotate the ground plane by precisely 45 degrees, easy peasy, and then you take the lattice and then you open up that so that you can see it. You select the lattice, click into edit mode, click A to select all of it, S to scale along the y-axis by 2, press enter, and then you can see in the viewport, if I enable the camera grid, which is already on, I just can't see it, you can see that these things perfectly line up to the grid. Yeah, and so we're looking through this from like a perspective through a camera now, and these tiles, like, they match perfectly. It's 2 up, 5 across, 4 backwards, and with that one, 2 up, 3 across, 3 backwards. Yeah, and now I can flip into I can do a render by pressing F12, and this will take a couple of seconds. Right. Okay, and in this example, I'm rendering the grid with it, that camera grid with it, just for demonstration. But you can just toggle that off. Just click of a button, toggle it off, and then I'm going to go to image, and I'm going to go save as, and I'm going to go scale test 2. Call it. Save as image. Right, and then if I go down here and I go into GIMP again, I can go File, Open, Scale Test 2, open that up. Right, so now we can see that that image is rendered out. This is just a 2D image now, and if I put my GIMP grid on, 2 seconds, there you go, and you can see it's matched up perfectly. See how those grid lines are absolutely spot on to this grid. So all of these models that we've created are absolutely predictable. Yeah, we know exactly what they're going to look like when they turn out in 3D, in 2D rather. And if I take a little sampling of this, so I'll just get my snapping on, right, Control C and Control V, we can see like it's perfectly the same sort of aspect ratio. You know, that fits onto it 100% accurately. Except with the 3D stuff, all the shadows are done for me, or the windows are emitting light. We've even got shadows on the doorknob and stuff like that, stuff that you'd never get. And these models, you know, these are knocked up. These are tests. This is nothing compared to what is achievable. This is like day 2 rubbish, but it just works, and it's gonna be awesome. Just trust me. Like by the end of it, you're gonna be able to create all kinds of assets. You're gonna be able to get all your shading sorted. Switch out all your materials. I'm going to be creating like individual windows that actually look decent, and proper doors that look decent, and just make a whole sort of procedural 3D engine for creating RPG Maker stuff, and working in this style is amazing. So So, like I say, this is just the seeds of something really, really cool coming. I know that it works now, and yeah, so that's it. Take care.